Hello, Cassidy here, and today I want to talk about narrative. I have been thinking a lot about this idea of meaning and purpose and how we understand our place in the world and trying to orient ourselves to behave well in it. And as I have been on this journey trying to uncover good ways to get at that question, I keep getting drawn back to narrative. I think as humans, we are wired to see through a narrative lens. We can't help it. It infects everything from the fiction we consume to science and logic. All of these actions are driven to either make sense of or challenge the story that we are seeing play out in the world around us. And we're doing this because to have that sense of a story makes our life more livable. But it gets really difficult when we realize that there are so many conflicting stories being told to us, particularly as modern people. Say, for instance, you go on the street in a big city and you ask 50 people, what is the meaning of life? What story do we find ourselves in? I guarantee you're going to get 50 different answers. And it gets even more complicated because you do the same thing on the other side of the world in a different culture that has different strongly held beliefs and different demographics. You're probably going to get 50 different answers and more varying than the ones that you had before. Now, the initial prompt is so broad, you might be able to find some consistency within answers and taking out some of the outliers, find a through line of what, as humans, we think is really valuable and meaningful and what is this story we live. But I almost guarantee that if you continue to probe on that question, asking deeper of, well, what does that look like to practically live that story out, you are going to get more and more conflicting answers farther down the rabbit hole you go. And this is one of the things that I think makes it really hard when trying to get to this place of uncovering what is meaningful or what story we live in. So what do? We have all of these conflicting stories flying at us, and often they're filled with appeals to convince us that the story they have gives you a sense of the right way to live. And how do you navigate that when it feels like these stories are so fragmented and diverse? And that is a question that I've been struggling with for years. And I guess I've come to a point where I feel like the best way to start in answering that question is understanding the place that I have in the story I'm in. And before I can really do that, I first have to recognize the story I think I'm in. So I have this belief that whether we recognize it or not, we all live in the frame of our own grand narrative. And what I mean by that is that we all have this subjective perspective as individuals that we appeal to, that help us navigate and orient in the world and shape us as we form our beliefs, act those out, and try to ground ourselves in the story we find ourselves in. And we often talk about large-scale belief in this idea of worldview. And I certainly think that's part of what I see a grand narrative being. But I like this distinction and framing because while we can use worldview as a way to label or easily describe and characterize the things we believe, it's only a part of the way that we navigate and see the world. It doesn't give us a whole perspective in the way that we uncover the story we think we're in. There are all these different ways that we go about informing our grand narrative, whether it's the experiences we face, the people we meet, the things we consume, or the feelings and instincts that are evoked from us with all of those encounters. But each of these things weave together and become a factor in the thing that informs us of the story we believe we're in. But there's a little bit of trickiness when you're navigating this idea of grand narrative, and it ties back to this diversity of perspective. While we as individuals each have our own grand narrative, no two grand narratives are alike. We all have slightly or largely differing ideas and beliefs that are conflicting as we're making sense of the ultimate shape and reality of the world. The problem even manifests itself in this idea of worldviews. You can use that to sort of narrow things down, get a more concentrated understanding of what somebody believes, but there's even diversity within those labels. No two Christians are alike. Not every secular materialist is the same. So while a grand narrative or a worldview can tell us something about the way someone perceives the world or their deeply held beliefs, there still lies this tension of how do we understand what that means for our own perception of the world. But because of this diversity in stories and how we live out the world in the subjective way, you start to understand and get a sense of the truth in the idea that what might be true for me is not true for you. And in some ways that can help us live with this tension and understand there might be a lot of overlap, but this is why we might see some of this diversity. But I think if we stop there, we get ourselves into a little bit of a pickle. I think in all of us, we have this sense that the narrative we find ourselves in as humans is not one of our own creation. The reality we see in the world is not affected by how we wish it to be, but in fact, it's discovered and sometimes disappointing because it doesn't match our expectations. When we seek out other grand narratives and compare them to our own, we realize that there are so many differences in that, and some that are competing, contradictory, or completely incompatible with one another. And so in the statement, what is true for me might not be true for you, it accounts for these differences, but it doesn't really get us very far in understanding how do we tackle what it means for us to have these differences while still being embedded in the same story. You know, if we were all independently the ones creating and constructing the narrative, this sort of diversity wouldn't be as much of a problem. We see this all the time in fiction and fantasy. Each new story that we encounter is enclosed in its own world, with each having their own rules and strictures of what that world looks like and how things play out in that reality that don't affect the others. While the characters in the narrative are bound to the rules and structures of the world, as a reader, we're not that fussed when the rules of one world don't perfectly align in unity with the rules of another. You know, if Dumbledore can wield power that Gandalf can't, well, we're not that fussed. The real tragedy is when the rules of one world don't make sense of itself or leaves holes in the narrative. And I think it's the same instinct that makes us uncomfortable when we face the differences and beliefs that we see manifested in our own. When we see someone who has a grand narrative that is so fundamentally and morally different than our own, we can't help but feel a bit of an uncomfortability in wrestling with that. And that uncomfortability manifests itself in a lot of different ways. Sometimes we just contemplate silently about it. Other times we feel like we have to challenge or correct it. And there are other times where we completely disregard the person, label them as immoral, and put them to the edge of society, not worthy to be engaged with. And each of these reactions vary in severity and probably are dictated a lot by the mode in which the person operates who is wielding them. But all of these reactions are sort of pointing to the same thing. And it's this realization that there are holes in the narrative and we want to find a way to make sense of it. There's a sense that even though we have our own grand narrative, we are appealing to some sort of ultimate narrative. I've always been really interested in human dynamics and the way that we interact with each other. And as I have been facing my own sense of conflict with this idea of like the grand narrative I hold and the differences of the grand narrative of others, I've been watching myself and those around me, the reactions that we have to this type of tension. And there are two sort of really distinct extremes that I see often play out. The first is this doubling down on the thing that we believe. We do whatever we can to hold on to the story we already have, whether that's finding rational arguments to help us feel more solid in our understanding intellectually with that, appealing to authorities to give us credence in the things that we believe, and finding people we trust to sort of help ground that understanding more. And sometimes it's just ignoring all of the information altogether and holding on in an act of what you might call blind faith to resolve these issues. And in many ways, this instinct to hold on to the thing that you already have is so human to me, and it's really understandable. This is the thing that has gotten us through life up until this point. And there's always that question of, what does that mean if I lose it? And how do I reorient myself in the world? And I think in places where our grand narrative is aligned with our ultimate narrative, it can really be helpful in navigating storms and the uncertainty of what life is, even when we ourselves are doubting those questions. But with this trust that we give in our own perception of the narrative, there's always this risk that our perception of the world is wrong. And there are varying degrees in severity of what it means to have the wrong answer to an ultimate question in reality. But there's always going to be some effect in the way we see and navigate the world. And some of those can really negatively impact the way that we pursue a meaningful life. And so we have to start asking ourselves, what are we risking by doubling down and really trying hard to hold to the story that we see? But then there's the other side of the coin. While many of us might hold on to the narrative we see and double down and try to hold on to the perception of reality that we were given up to this point, there's another group of people who throw everything out. And there's a lot of different ways that can manifest itself as well. One can be embracing an opposite story or something very different to what we had before and hold that as truth in place of the thing that we had. But sometimes this category breaking of seeing inconsistencies in our narratives gets us so unsure and so untrusting of our own perception that we try to avoid any judgment claims about narratives that we hold or that other people have. And this sort of mode of throwing it out is probably more drastic than the doubling down effect. But in the same way, it's sort of understandable. Nobody wants to be deluded about what they see in reality. And so when it feels like the story you had before is crumbling in front of your eyes, it can be really easy to jump ship and try to find something else to replace it that gives you that stronger foundation, or at least keeps you from being crushed by the weight of the crumbling narrative. And maybe this jump is a good thing, right? You're trading something that wasn't true for something truer. But with that action comes a risk too. What if what you perceived as a complete destruction of the story that you found yourself in is actually something that would have survived whatever earthquake or questioning that you had if you had given it enough trust and enough faith? That's the difficult part of navigating this sort of tension, is that every action we take comes with consequences and trade-offs, and we will never know what the reality of those things are until we've already lived them, at least not in the fullest sense. And often the consequences, they just come out in the most unexpected ways. Now, as humans, these are two extreme reactions we have, both probably on the farther ends of the spectrum. And in reality, as humans, we probably react somewhere in the messy middle. Sometimes we're holding on, sometimes we're throwing out. And sometimes it feels like the pendulum's just swinging back and forth so aggressively that we're dizzying ourselves in the orientation and trying to get a sense of what is true and how do we ground ourselves when we ourselves are doubting the perception we see. And more times in my life than I would have liked, I have felt this division in myself and this dizziness of trying to make sense of the story I was given, the story I was consuming, the story that other people were seeing around me, and the story I was seeing through my lived experience. And so many times there was joy in that process, but very often it felt like I was being pulled apart or frozen in place or so lost and in the dark of not knowing how to make sense of any of it that I didn't even know how to take a step. All I knew is that I wanted, as best as I could, to take this grand narrative that I was seeing and have it align with the ultimate narrative I find myself in. And if you're anything like me, you probably have that instinct as well. And you might be right in the middle of this feeling of being torn with that. And you're asking yourself the question, how do I make sense of my grand narrative? How do I wrestle with that in the face of others' narratives? And how do we work together to get to this place where we have a better sense of the ultimate narrative we're living in. And that is a big question. And I don't think there are hard and fast rules that fit all people. And so I won't pretend I have a confidence in the answer of how to actually live that out. I'm still very much in the process of trying to understand how I myself, but my participation in a larger community can do that better. But throughout what's probably been a decade of of this wrestling, I have come to some helpful things that have grounded me in that search. And so I want to share some of those with you, and I don't know, maybe they'll help you. So the first one, slow down. I think there is this instinct to just keep running and trying to uncover and discover what it is that makes up this life and what we're searching for. And it can be really intoxicating to throw yourself into it and be in this search, in a race against time to understand reality in the best way we can. But I think sometimes that does a really big disservice to understanding the patience of what it takes to understand the world and how to participate well in it. And so if we can find ways to be still and slow down and let things actually sink in that we're consuming. Because if we're consuming too much and not giving that space to let it sink in and process, we lose so much of it. And it doesn't, our brains aren't really designed to do that. I think by slowing down, taking a breath, it gave me a chance to process through all of this uncertainty and this tension and get me more comfortable with the mystery and the realization that I might not get all of the answers I'm searching for. But certainly slowing down helped me find better answers and be more humble in the process of trying to find them. And the results of this has been that I am avoiding more burnout. I don't jump to conclusions or cling so hard to something just to feel like I'm making progress, and really take the time to slow down and understand what I don't know and contemplate the complexities of those realities and hear the stories of others. The second thing I would say is being more intentional about the things that I'm consuming. I think that everything we ingest shapes and molds us. And there are all these different ways and unintended consequences that come from that consumption. But if we aren't being thoughtful about how we're consuming, we're allowing this information to rewire and reshape us. And it might end up shaping us in a way that might not be the most beneficial for us as humans and how we act in the world. And I just really think that if we can find ways to be more discerning about the things that we're ingesting and consuming, it's going to make a huge impact in navigating the world, not only for ourselves, but with those that we engage in this process with. I think for each person, that pattern's going to look different. Maybe it means completely getting off YouTube and avoiding these spirals, but for others, maybe, and probably most of us, it's probably just being more intentional about what we click. Really starting to think about, why am I consuming this? What is it doing to me? Is it making me and shaping me into a person that I think that I want to be, that I think it's good to be? And I think it gets us to a place to start identifying what might be better to consume and what we should try to sort of weed out of our lives. As time goes on, I think these things are always going to evolve. Something that is valuable for you right now might not be valuable for you 5 years from now. But if we start asking these questions, looking to the things that are valuable and are shaping us into better versions of ourselves, we're going to have a better relationship and participation with everything we consume, from books, movies, podcasts, what have you. I think intentionality in all areas of life can be really helpful, but I think it's particularly important in what we're consuming, especially because that has such a power to change the way we see the world and convince us of the story we believe we're in. The third thing I think is really important is to pay attention to emotions and instincts. Ben Shapiro has made it very popular to point out that facts don't care about your feelings. And I'm not here to argue against that sentiment. What I will say is that the way we feel about something can definitely impact how we take facts and information in. And by acknowledging that, it can give us some benefit in understanding what we believe and why, and kind of help us identify the story we think we're in. But it also might be pointing towards something that is important about the way we're being delivered true information, or the narrative that these facts are being utilized in. Most of the time when we're dealing with facts and figures, it's not just in a straightforward way. They're very much weaved into some sort of narrative frame. And the times we are given just raw data, it's very hard not to use that and try putting it into some narrative ourselves, and make it useful to us and our participation in the world, and the way we can interact with it as human beings. I think being cold and trying to separate our feelings and instincts completely from the rational sides of ourselves is just as dangerous as running headfirst into emotion and instincts to deal with things in the world that make us feel uncomfortable. Finding this way to balance both of them can be a really helpful participation in understanding the things that we're consuming, how we understand something to be true, and how we feel about those things. And I think there is a lot of value in understanding what is true about the world, but I don't think we should do that at the cost of paying attention to our instincts and feelings and how that affects the way that we participate in uncovering of the facts. So the fourth one is to learn to really listen to people. I think that this has been one that I've struggled with the most, and I'm still struggling to do well. I think it's really easy to get caught up in your own stories and your own perspective and the way you see the world, particularly if you're talking with someone who has varying beliefs than you. But there are so many times where we're in conversations and we're thinking about the next thing we want to say, instead of really engaging and listening and trying to understand the perspective of the person that's across from us. And that can often lead us to a place where we have all of these conversations and can't remember the last time that we really stopped to think, maybe I'm wrong about this, or have a true sense of being willing to change your mind if I can be proven wrong. And I think this mindset really opens you up to more of a protection mode or a challenging mode to defend the thing that you know and think is true, instead of being concerned with my own perception of reality and having that be aligned closely to what is ultimately true. I certainly think there's benefits for communities and society having a good sense of the ultimate reality together, but I can't control what anybody else is going to think. I can only control what I'm going to do. And so how do I best find that way to align myself and open myself up to understanding where my narrative is flawed, and letting that be the starting point before I ever decide to shape somebody else's or make an argument to convince someone else to see it how I see it, because I'm sure I have a lot of things wrong in the world. I guess ultimately, I just think that if we're more concerned about our own beliefs than others, we're going to have a better chance to be able to really hear people and see where we might be flawed in our own thinking. And, that sometimes means putting down my own grand narrative and seeing through the lens of someone else's. It doesn't mean that I'll change my mind necessarily, or that I'll think that the narrative they have is superior to mine, but it might give me a glimpse of something that is more beautiful than what I hold, and could give me a better sense of what is beautiful, good, and true in the world in a way that I could never see it before. The fifth thing I would say is don't abandon community participation. I think in a lot of ways it can be really easy when you get caught up in this mode. You don't know where to go to answer these questions or have good dialogues about these things. And there's this instinct to just hide away, go into your internet bubble and search and do these things on your own. I think having a group of people you trust to work through these types of things is so invaluable. And not everybody's going to be the right fit to give you what you need. Like, it can be a very daunting task to open yourself up and be vulnerable in that way. And it can be really scary in how you'll be perceived or judged, particularly, I think, if you are in religious communities and having these questions, at least particular parishes and those sorts of things. But I do believe that if you're open to finding support and you keep searching, you will find people who can work with you together through this, and it's just going to be so much better having that support than trying to do it all on your own. And there's ways that can manifest itself too. You can find those people who help you slow down and disconnect and don't engage with you in these big questions and kind of get you grounded in reality. But it also can be the person who you share these questions with. They can challenge your assumptions, and you can go back and forth and have a conversation that feels like it's built on trust, where you don't have to placate the thing you believe, but you don't also have to feel like it's a place where you're going to be ostracized for sharing something different or altering. And I do think those places exist, and I think far more people are wanting to engage in that way than it can sometimes feel when we're caught up in our own little world of trying to figure these questions out and having trouble finding those people who we can do that with. So I guess my advice would be to find a community that you can be open and sincere with and feel like you're heard, but that don't just tell you what you want to hear. They challenge you and give you a space that you can really listen to and feel like you can incorporate and be heard. And the last thing, don't minimize beauty. I've talked about beauty here before, and I will talk about it in the future, but I think often when we talk about the idea of finding some sort of truth in the world or ultimate reality, we really minimize the role that beauty can play in getting to better answers of these big questions. I think it's often treated as sort of a distraction, and we would rather focus on the things that are true and are good. But there's a certain power to beauty that I've discovered in the last couple of years that can really enchant us and ground us in some of the really positive aspects of the world, because truth sometimes can be very difficult, and doing the right thing is not always the easiest. And to have some sort of sense of beauty in the world that motivates us to keep moving towards those things can be so incredibly impactful. And I think beauty is similar to this idea of emotion and instinct, where it has this ability to point to something or reveal something in what is good and what is true, and participating and orienting ourselves in this story. And so to discredit that takes a huge part of this process off the table. And I think it's one of the most powerful things to being able to ground and help participate in all of the other things, whether it's slowing down or finding community. That beauty aspect is huge. I mean, when I look at myself, when I brought beauty more intentionally into the conversation and let it engage in this dance with truth and goodness and valuing all three of those things, the exploration of things became a lot easier for me and much more enjoyable. But it also started to re-enchant the world, and it expanded my categories, and it gave me a sense of clarity that I couldn't see before. And I think that's really all we're trying to do in these conversations and challenging our own perspectives and biases, is find clarity in the world and get sense of how it actually is. And there's a superpower to beauty to do that I don't think we're fully acknowledging. Well, anyways, that's all I have for now. I hope you found those things helpful. Let me know if you did. And otherwise, I'll see you next video.